They say money can't buy happiness, but it can sure as hell buy a lot of other things. Things like security, freedom, a life without constantly checking your bank balance and wincing. For Sarah, a nurse at County General, money wasn't just a desirable thing, it was an obsession. Not the flashy, diamond and champagne kind of obsession, but the quiet, gnawing, desperate kind. The kind that keeps you up at night, replaying your financial woes in your head like a broken record. Sarah was good at her job. Compassionate, efficient, the kind of nurse patients remembered long after they left the hospital. She had that innate ability to soothe anxieties, to offer a comforting touch, a reassuring smile. Her colleagues admired her dedication. Her patients trusted her implicitly. But behind the professional facade, behind the starched scrubs and the practiced empathy, Sarah was living a different life. A life of quiet desperation. Her apartment was small, cramped, a constant reminder of her limited means. The furniture was secondhand, the appliances outdated. She meticulously tracked every penny, clipping coupons, skipping meals, sacrificing small luxuries that most people took for granted. The weight of student loans, credit card debt, and the ever-present fear of unexpected expenses pressed down on her like a physical burden. She dreamed of a different life, a life where she wasn't constantly calculating, constantly worrying, constantly feeling the pinch. Then came Mark. Mark wasn't your typical Prince Charming. He was a software developer, awkward, introverted, more comfortable with code than conversation. He wasn't conventionally attractive, his clothes were often rumpled, and his social skills were, well, let's just say he was more at home in a server room than a crowded bar. But Mark had something that Sarah craved more than anything else in the world. Money. A lot of it. He'd stumbled into the world of cryptocurrency early, investing in Bitcoin when it was still a fringe concept, a digital novelty. And now, years later, that gamble had paid off spectacularly. He was rich, not just comfortably well off, but genuinely, life-changingly rich. He could buy a mansion, travel the world, retire early. But instead, he mostly used his newfound wealth to buy gadgets, upgrade his tech setup, and indulge in his quiet hobbies. He was still the same awkward Mark, just with a much bigger bank account. Sarah met Mark at a hospital fundraiser. He was there, slightly out of place, nursing a glass of wine and looking endearingly lost. Sarah, ever the professional, approached him with a friendly smile, making polite conversation. Mark, instantly captivated by her warmth and genuine interest, or so he thought, was hooked. He'd never been good with women, never understood the subtle cues and unspoken signals of attraction. Sarah, with her easy smile and attentive gaze, seemed like a dream come true. Their relationship progressed quickly. Mark, eager to please, showered Sarah with gifts, expensive dinners, designer handbags, jewelry she'd only seen in magazines. Sarah accepted these gifts with a practiced grace, outwardly appreciative, inwardly calculating. Each gift was a tangible reminder of Mark's wealth, a symbol of the future she envisioned for herself. She played the role of the devoted girlfriend, listening patiently to his tech talk, laughing at his awkward jokes, and feigning interest in his obscure hobbies. Mark, completely oblivious to her true motives, basked in her attention, convinced he'd finally found someone who truly cared for him. But Sarah's heart belonged to someone else. David, charismatic, charming, and utterly unreliable. David was everything Mark wasn't. He was the bad boy, the rebel, the kind of man who made your heart race and your pulse quicken. Their relationship was a roller coaster, passionate highs and dramatic lows, fueled by a mixture of genuine affection and destructive tendencies. David was a dreamer, always chasing the next big thing, the next get-rich-quick scheme. He had no stable job, no real ambition, but he had an undeniable magnetism that Sarah found irresistible. Despite their tumultuous past, despite David's lack of financial security, Sarah couldn't let him go. They continued to meet in secret, their encounters filled with stolen kisses and whispered promises. Sarah confided in David about Mark, about his Bitcoin fortune, about her dreams of a better life. David, ever the opportunist, saw an opportunity. He encouraged Sarah, subtly planting the idea that she deserved a share of Mark's wealth, that she shouldn't settle for less. He painted a picture of a future where they could be together, free from financial worries, living a life of luxury. As Sarah's obsession with Mark's Bitcoin grew, so did her desperation. The thought of all that money, just sitting there in a digital wallet, was a constant temptation. She imagined herself finally free from debt, able to pursue her dreams, to live the life she always wanted. The line between fantasy and reality began to blur. She started to see Mark not as a person, but as a means to an end. He was the key to her freedom, the gateway to her dreams. One night, Sarah decided to take action. She invited Mark over for dinner, cooking him his favorite meal, pouring him glass after glass of his preferred wine. She was attentive, affectionate, playing the role of the perfect girlfriend to the hilt. But beneath the surface, a different plan was taking shape. She'd researched different ways to access Mark's Bitcoin wallet, learning about his security protocols, his multi-factor authentication. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to try. As the evening progressed, Sarah subtly slipped a drug into Mark's wine. It was a sedative, something she'd borrowed from the hospital, something that would make him drowsy, compliant. She waited patiently, watching as Mark finished his wine, his eyes starting to droop. She knew she had to act quickly, but something wasn't right. Mark, despite the drugs, wasn't as sleepy as she'd expected. He was acting strangely, his movements jerky, his speech slurred. He seemed suspicious. He kept looking at her, his eyes narrowed, a flicker of unease in their depths. Had he noticed something? Had he figured out her plan? Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she had to be careful. Then, Mark said something that made her blood run cold. "Sarah," he mumbled, his voice thick, I know what you're trying to do." A wave of panic washed over Sarah. She'd been so careful, so meticulous. How could he have known? Had he been playing her all along? Was he setting a trap? She didn't have time to think. She had to act. She lunged for his phone, but Mark reacted quickly, grabbing her arm. A struggle ensued, a desperate, chaotic fight fueled by fear, greed, and the primal instinct for survival. In the heat of the moment, in a surge of adrenaline and terror, Sarah did something she never thought she was capable of. She lashed out, striking Mark with a heavy object, a vase that sat on the nearby table. He fell to the ground, his body going limp. Sarah stood there, frozen, the vase still clutched in her hand. She stared at Mark's lifeless body, her mind reeling, her heart pounding in her ears. She'd done it. She'd killed him. The weight of her actions crashed down on her, a crushing wave of guilt and fear. But amidst the terror, a small, insidious voice whispered in her ear. The Bitcoin. It was still there. She could still get it. She just had to be smart. She had to be careful. She had to cover her tracks. And so, Sarah, the nurse, the caregiver, the woman obsessed with financial freedom, became something else entirely. She became a murderer. The initial shock gave way to a chilling clarity. Sarah, her hands still trembling, surveyed the scene. Mark lay motionless on the floor, a dark stain spreading across the carpet beneath him. The vase, the murder weapon, lay shattered beside him, a silent testament to her crime. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but she fought it back. She couldn't afford to lose control, not now. Years of watching medical dramas, of witnessing the aftermath of violence and tragedy, had inadvertently prepared her for this moment. She knew what needed to be done. First, the vase. She carefully gathered the fragments, wrapping them in a towel before disposing of them in the trash. Then, she turned her attention to Mark's body. She checked for a pulse, a faint hope flickering within her that he might still be alive. But there was nothing. His skin was cold, his eyes glazed over. He was gone. With a heavy heart, she began to stage the scene. She retrieved a bottle of prescription pills from Mark's bathroom, carefully scattering a few on the floor near his hand. She arranged his body in a way that suggested an accidental overdose, a tragic end for a man who had everything. She wiped down surfaces, removing any fingerprints, any trace of her presence. She worked methodically, her movements precise, her mind focused on the task at hand. The cover-up was messy, imperfect, but it was the best she could do under the circumstances. She knew the police would investigate, but she hoped the scene would be convincing enough to deflect suspicion. She was a nurse, after all. She knew how to make things look natural. Once the scene was set, Sarah turned her attention to the real prize, Mark's Bitcoin. She retrieved his phone from his pocket, her fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar device. She'd seen him use it countless times, but she'd never paid much attention to the details. Now, those details were everything. She tried to unlock the phone, but it was protected by a passcode. She tried Mark's birthday, their anniversary, a few other obvious combinations, but nothing worked. Frustration mounted, her anxiety growing with each failed attempt. She couldn't believe it. After all this, after everything she'd done, she was going to be locked out of his fortune? Then, she remembered something. Mark had a habit of writing down important information, little notes and reminders scattered throughout his apartment. She began to search, frantically checking drawers, flipping through notebooks, scanning every surface. Finally, tucked away in an old journal, she found it. A small piece of paper with a series of numbers scrawled on it. It was Mark's passcode. With trembling hands, she entered the code. The phone unlocked. Relief washed over her, followed by a surge of triumph. She had it. She had access to his Bitcoin wallet. She was one step closer to the life she'd always dreamed of. But her triumph was short-lived. When she opened the cryptocurrency app, she was met with another obstacle. A complex multi-factor authentication system. Mark, ever the cautious techie, had implemented multiple layers of security, requiring not just a password but also a fingerprint scan and a unique code generated by a separate authentication app. Sarah felt a wave of despair wash over her. She didn't have his fingerprint, and she certainly didn't have access to his authentication app. She tried everything she could think of. She searched his apartment for clues, for any hint of how to bypass the security measures. She spent hours online, scouring forums and tutorials, desperately seeking a way in. But it was no use. Mark's Bitcoin wallet was a fortress, and she was locked out. The hours that followed were a blur of anxiety and frustration. Sarah paced the apartment, her mind racing, her emotions swinging wildly between elation and despair. She'd committed the ultimate crime, but the reward, the very thing that had driven her to this point, remained tantalizingly out of reach. As the first rays of dawn crept through the windows, Sarah knew she had to leave. She couldn't stay in Mark's apartment any longer. She gathered her things, carefully wiping down any surfaces she might have touched. She took a few of Mark's valuables, a gold watch, a pair of diamond cufflinks, small tokens of her victory, even if she couldn't access the Bitcoin yet. She left the apartment, locking the door behind her, and walked out into the morning light, a murderer disguised as a grieving girlfriend. The police arrived later that morning, alerted by a concerned neighbor who hadn't seen Mark in a while. Sarah, having prepared herself for this moment, answered their questions with a practiced sadness, her voice trembling, her eyes filled with tears. She told them about Mark's struggles with anxiety, his occasional reliance on prescription medication. She painted a picture of a man who had tragically succumbed to his demons, a victim of his own success. The detectives listened patiently, their faces impassive. They examined the scene, taking note of the scattered pills, the seemingly accidental arrangement of Mark's body. They questioned Sarah further, probing for inconsistencies, for any hint of doubt. But Sarah held her ground, her performance flawless. She was, after all, a nurse. She knew how to play the role of the concerned caregiver. As the detectives concluded their initial investigation, Sarah felt a surge of relief. She'd done it. She'd fooled them. She was free. But as she watched them leave, a flicker of doubt crossed her mind. Had she truly convinced them? Or were they merely playing along, waiting for her to slip up, to reveal her true nature? Meanwhile, miles away, David watched the news reports of Mark's death, a predatory gleam in his eyes. He knew Sarah's secret. He knew about the Bitcoin. and he knew that she was vulnerable. He smiled, a slow, cruel smile. It was time to pay his dear friend a visit. David arrived at Sarah's apartment unannounced, a smirk playing on his lips. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, exuding an air of casual menace. So, he began, his voice low and gravelly. I heard about Mark. Tragic accident, right? Sarah's carefully constructed composure faltered. She'd been expecting him, dreading this moment since she'd left Mark's apartment. David, she said. Her voice strained. What do you want? He chuckled. What do I want? Come on, Sarah, you know what I want. The Bitcoin. $5 million worth of digital gold. It's a life changer, and I think we both deserve a piece of the pie. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. There's no weeb in this, David, she retorted, trying to project an air of confidence she didn't feel. And besides, I told you I can't access the wallet. It's locked. David's smirk widened. Don't play coy with me, Sarah. I know you're smarter than that. You wouldn't go through all that trouble for nothing. You got the phone, didn't you? You must have figured out a way in. Sarah hesitated, her mind racing. She couldn't admit she'd failed. She couldn't let David know she was vulnerable. I'm working on it, she said, trying to buy time. It's complicated. Complicated, David scoffed. Or just inconvenient. Look, Sarah, I'm not stupid. I know what you did. And I know you need me. You need me to keep my mouth shut. And I don't come cheap. The power dynamic had shifted. David, sensing her weakness, was now in control. He wasn't just her lover anymore. He was her blackmailer, her accomplice. And he was ruthless. How much? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Half, David replied, his eyes gleaming with greed. Half of the Bitcoin. Consider it my silence fee. And don't even think about trying to double-cross me. I have ways of making sure you keep your end of the bargain. Sarah felt trapped. She'd committed murder for the Bitcoin, but now she was being blackmailed for it, even though it was still locked away. She'd traded one prison for another. Meanwhile, the police investigation was gaining momentum. Detectives, reviewing the evidence from Mark's apartment, found inconsistencies in Sarah's story. The scene, though carefully staged, wasn't perfect. There were subtle signs of a struggle, faint traces of blood that didn't match Mark's. And Sarah's demeanor, though outwardly calm, betrayed a hint of nervousness, a flicker of guilt in her eyes. They began to dig deeper into Sarah's background, uncovering her financial troubles, her history with David, her desperate need for money. They interviewed her colleagues, her neighbors, piecing together a picture of a woman driven by ambition and desperation. They discovered her secret meetings with David, their whispered conversations about Mark and the Bitcoin. As the net tightened around Sarah, she became more and more reckless. She made mistakes, small but significant errors that raised the detective's suspicions. She avoided contact with David, fearing he would betray her. She became paranoid, imagining that she was being watched, that her every move was being scrutinized. The detectives, following a hunch, decided to re-interview Sarah. This time they were more aggressive, more direct. They confronted her with the inconsistencies in her story, the evidence they had gathered, the suspicions they harbored. Sarah, under the intense pressure, began to crack. Her carefully constructed facade crumbled, revealing the fear and guilt that lay beneath. Meanwhile, David, sensing that the police were closing in, decided to take matters into his own hands. He confronted Sarah again, demanding his share of the Bitcoin, threatening to go to the police if she didn't cooperate. Their argument escalated, fueled by desperation and betrayal. Accusations were thrown, secrets revealed, and old wounds reopened. The courtroom was silent. Sarah, her face pale and drawn, stood before the judge, the weight of her actions pressing down on her like a physical burden. David, his usual swagger replaced by a look of sullen resentment, stood beside her. The judge, his voice grave, delivered the sentence. Guilty. Murder. Blackmail. Accessory to murder. Years. Years in prison. The words echoed through the room, sealing their fate. As the bailiffs led them away, Sarah glanced back at the courtroom, a flicker of regret in her eyes. She'd killed for money, for a chance at a better life, but all she'd gained was a prison cell and a lifetime of remorse. David, his gaze fixed on the floor, seemed to have finally grasped the enormity of his mistakes. He'd gambled on Sarah's desperation, believing he could profit from her crime, but he'd ended up losing everything. The 5 Bitcoin, the object of their obsession, remained untouched, locked away in Mark's digital wallet, a silent testament to the futility of their greed. It was a fortune that could have changed lives, but it had ultimately brought only death and destruction. But the story doesn't end there. It leaves us with questions, uncomfortable questions that linger long after the credits roll. What drives a person to commit such a heinous act? Is it pure greed, or is there something more complex at play? Is it the lure of wealth, the promise of a life free from hardship, or is it a deeper, more primal desire for power and control? And what about the victims? Mark, the awkward techie with a heart of gold, whose life was cut short by a woman he trusted. What about the dreams he had, the potential he possessed? What about the family and friends he left behind, forever haunted by the tragedy of his death? And Sarah and David? Are they simply evil, or are they products of their circumstances, victims of a society that glorifies wealth and success at any cost? Can they ever truly atone for their crimes? Can they ever find redemption in the darkness of their prison cells? These are not easy questions to answer. They force us to confront the dark side of human nature, the capacity for both great good and unspeakable evil that resides within us all. They challenge us to examine our own values, our own desires, our own pursuit of happiness. What do you think? What would you have done in Sarah's situation? Could you have resisted the temptation of such a vast fortune? Could you have walked away from the chance to change your life forever? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories. And don't forget to share it with your friends. The more people who see this story, the more we can learn from it. The more we can understand the dark side of human nature, the better equipped we are to prevent such tragedies from happening again. Thank you for watching.